Millionaire gets into a car accident, ends up in a wheelchair and loses the will to live. His mother hires a nurse who takes care of him and becomes his love. The impact was violent. Twisted metal shattered glass, and the deafening sound of the collision filled the rainy night in Portland, Oregon. Samuel Winters barely had time to process what was happening when his state-of-the-art Mercedes-Benz spun out of control at the intersection of Broadway Street and the Pearl District, crashing into the guardrail. That split second would forever change the life of the CEO of Winters Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the northwestern United States. Samuel, known for his relentless determination in business and arrogance in personal relationships, woke up 3 days later in Portland Medical Center with news that would shatter his perfectly controlled world. He was paralyzed from the waist down. 6 months later, the Winters mansion in the exclusive West Hills area had turned into a self-imposed prison. The corridors, once filled with the sound of business meetings and sophisticated dinners, now echoed only silence and Samuel's occasional angry outbursts. "You can't go on like this, darling," Elizabeth Winters said, watching her son through the office window on the second floor, where he remained motionless in his wheelchair, gazing out at the immaculate gardens he could no longer walk through. "We need specialized help." Samuel didn't even bother to turn his chair to face his mother. "I've already told you that I don't want any more nurses or physiotherapists. They're all incompetent, and their false words of encouragement make me nauseous." Elizabeth sighed, but this time she was determined. She had found someone different, someone who might be able to reach her son through the thick walls he had built around himself. Isabella Reynolds drove through the gates of the Winters mansion the next morning, her modest Honda Civic, looking out of place among the lavish sculptures and fountains in the front garden. At 28, she had already earned a respectable reputation in the field of trauma nursing, but this case was different, not just because of the professional challenge, but because of the weight of the secret it carried. "Miss Reynolds," Elizabeth greeted her at the main entrance. "Welcome. Samuel is in the office as usual." Her voice betrayed concern and hope at the same time. Isabella adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her hands sweating slightly. The photo of her brother Marcus flashed in her mind, the last one they had taken together before that fateful night, when he had drunkenly caused the accident that had changed so many lives. Marcus was serving his sentence in the state penitentiary, but the guilt the family carried was a prison without walls. The first meeting went exactly as she expected. Samuel greeted her with barely disguised disdain, his ice-blue eyes appraising her with contempt. "Another savior?" he asked sarcastically. "Let me guess you're going to tell me that with positive thinking and determination, I can overcome any obstacle." Isabella maintained her professional posture, placing her briefcase on the mahogany desk. "Actually, Mr. Winters, I've come to tell you that your current condition doesn't define who you are, but your attitude does. And at the moment, you're doing a lousy job." The silence that followed was cutting. Elizabeth, who was watching from the doorway, held her breath. No one ever spoke to Samuel Winters like that, not even before the accident. To everyone's surprise, a small smile appeared at the corner of Samuel's lips. Finally, someone with the courage to tell the truth. The following weeks established an intensive routine. Isabella was not only competent in her physical work, but had a unique way of dealing with Samuel. She alternated between firmness and compassion, never allowing him to indulge in self-pity, but also recognizing his achievements no matter how small. During the physiotherapy sessions in the mansion's adapted gym, Isabella noticed subtle changes. Samuel began to show more determination, his acid comments diminished, and occasionally she even managed to get a genuine smile out of him. But each step forward was accompanied by a twinge of guilt in her heart. On the nights she returned to her small apartment in southeast Portland, Isabella would find herself rereading Marcus's letters from prison. "I have to do something to fix this, Bella," he had written, "even if it takes a lifetime." What neither of them could have predicted was how that mission of redemption would turn into something deeper. Samuel began to look forward to the sessions, not just the physical therapy, but the moments of conversation that followed them. Isabella had the gift of making him see the world from a new perspective, without ever minimizing his struggles. One evening after a particularly intense session, they shared a moment of vulnerability. Samuel talked about his fears, his frustrations, and for the first time since the accident about his dreams for the future. Isabella listened to him, her heart torn between the growing connection she felt and the weight of the secret she carried. "You're different," Samuel said, watching her pack up the equipment. "I can't understand why, but you make me want to be better." Isabella froze for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. The truth threatened to escape her lips, but the fear of destroying all the progress they had made silenced her. What was being born between them was more than a therapist-patient relationship, more than a mission of redemption. It was something unexpected and dangerous considering the circumstances. Isabella knew that the closer they became, the more devastating the revelation of her secret would be. As she drove home that night in the soft Portland rain, Isabella realized she was at a crossroads. The road ahead was hazy, but one thing was clear: both her heart and her conscience could not remain intact on this journey. Isabella noticed the subtle change in Samuel during the 3rd week of treatment. The looks of disdain began to give way to cautious curiosity, and his acid responses were now mixed with moments of vulnerability that she knew were precious. "You never tell me about your family," Samuel commented during a particularly intense session of upper limb strengthening exercises. The question caught Isabella off guard, causing her to almost drop the towel she was holding. "There's not much to tell," she replied, maintaining the professional tone that had become her armor. "We're a simple family from Eugene." Samuel raised an eyebrow, his blue eyes fixed on her with that intensity that always made her feel as if he could see through her defenses. "For someone who insists so much on honesty, you have a peculiar talent for avoiding certain subjects." The comment hit Isabella like a punch in the gut. She busied herself adjusting her equipment, trying to ignore the weight of guilt she was carrying. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, probably another message from her mother about her upcoming visit to Marcus in the penitentiary. "Let's focus on you today," she deflected, assuming her professional posture. "I've got some new exercises that might help with the tenderness in your thighs." Samuel's physical progress was remarkable, surpassing the doctor's pessimistic expectations. Elizabeth watched the changes with tears in her eyes, not just because of his motor development, but because of the transformation in her son's behavior. The bitter man who had isolated himself from the world was beginning to give way to someone more reflective, more present. One afternoon, while they were working in the mansion's winter garden, a new environment that Isabella had suggested for the sessions, Samuel shared something unexpected. "I dreamt about the accident yesterday," he said, his voice softer than usual. "But this time it was different. I didn't feel anger, just sadness, not for the driver, but for who he left behind." Isabella felt her heart race. "What do you mean? There must be someone, family, friends, carrying the weight of this tragedy too. I've never thought about it before." Samuel's words echoed through the glass room, mingling with the soft sound of the decorative fountain. Isabella fought back the tears that threatened to form, remembering the nights her mother cried alone. In the kitchen, the silent visits to the prison, the weight her whole family carried. "You look different," Elizabeth commented to Isabella later as they poured tea in the kitchen. "More distant today." "Just tired." Isabella forced a smile, but Elizabeth had that piercing look in her eyes that was so reminiscent of her son. "You know, darling, sometimes we carry burdens we don't have to carry alone." The irony of those words almost made Isabella laugh. If Elizabeth knew the truth, would she still look at her with such affection? Would she still entrust her with the care of her son? The sessions continued, and with them the connection between Isabella and Samuel deepened. There were times when she almost forgot her original purpose, almost forgot that she was there not just as a therapist, but seeking some form of redemption for her family. During one particularly challenging exercise, Samuel managed to move his right knee slightly, a movement the doctors had said was unlikely. The joy on his face was contagious, and without thinking, Isabella hugged him. The moment only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough for both of them to feel something change. The warmth of his body, the soft scent of his cologne, the texture of his shirt under her fingers. Everything was imprinted on her memory with frightening clarity. "Sorry," she quickly pulled away, straightening her coat. That was very professional. "Don't apologize," Samuel replied, his voice hoarse. It was real. That word, real, haunted Isabella throughout the night. In her apartment, as she reread Marcus's last letter, she wondered what was truly real in her life now. The desire to help her brother, her growing feelings for Samuel, the guilt that consumed her every time she saw. Progress in her patient a text message lit up her cell phone. "Thank you for today, not just for the knee, but for making me believe again. S." Isabella looked at the photo of Marcus on her bedside table, then at the message from Samuel. Her heart and her conscience were fighting a silent battle. She knew she needed to tell the truth, but every day that passed made this revelation more difficult and potentially more devastating. The sound of the rain against her window was reminiscent of the crash her brother had described so many times during his prison visits. How could a single night, a single wrong decision, create ripples that affected so many lives for so long? Isabella closed her eyes, knowing that she was walking a fine line between redemption and destruction. What had begun as a mission of atonement had turned into something much more complex and dangerous. She was falling in love with the man her brother had irreparably harmed. News of Samuel Winter's surprising progress spread quickly through Portland's medical circles. The movement in his knee, however slight, represented a significant break in the initial prognosis. Dr. James Morrison, the neurologist following the case, requested an urgent meeting at the Winters mansion. "It's really remarkable," the doctor commented, adjusting his glasses as he examined Samuel. "His recovery is defying all expectations. Whatever Miss Reynolds is doing, it's working extraordinarily well." Isabella remained silent in the corner of the room, her heart torn between professional pride and mounting guilt. Each compliment on her work was like a small stab in her conscience. "I believe we can start considering more advanced therapies," continued Dr. Morrison, making notes on his clipboard. "Perhaps even the experimental program at the Seattle Rehabilitation Center." Samuel's eyes met Isabella's immediately. Seattle would mean a temporary move, possibly months of treatment away from Portland, away from her. "We need to discuss this in more detail," Samuel replied, his voice betraying an unusual hesitation. "I don't want to interrupt the progress we're making here." After the doctor left, a heavy silence settled over the office. Elizabeth, sensing the tension in the air, discreetly withdrew, leaving Samuel and Isabella alone. "Do you think I should go?" Samuel asked, turning his chair towards the window, watching the fine rain falling on the gardens. Isabella felt her stomach turn. The prospect of Samuel leaving should have been a relief, a chance to escape, before her feelings ran deeper, before the truth inevitably came out. So why did the idea make her so anxious? "Professionally, it would be an incredible opportunity," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "The Seattle program is revolutionary." "That's not what I asked, Isabella." He turned his chair, facing her directly. "I want to know your personal opinion." The use of her first name, something rare until then, made her heart leap. "I don't think it's appropriate to offer a personal opinion." "Why not? After everything we've shared over the past few weeks, you still insist on keeping such a professional distance?" The frustration in his voice was palpable. Isabella felt her defenses begin to crumble. How could she explain that distance was her only protection, that every moment of intimacy between them only made his secret heavier? "There are things about me that you don't know, Samuel," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly. "Then tell me," he replied, pulling his chair closer. "From day one I've felt that there's something more, something you hide behind that perfect professional facade." Isabella's phone vibrated in her pocket, another message from her mother about Marcus. The universe seemed determined not to let her forget her original purpose. "I have to go," she said abruptly, collecting her things. "Tomorrow we can discuss Seattle further." But Samuel wasn't willing to let her get away so easily. With an agility that surprised even himself, he managed to maneuver his chair to block her path to the door. "Why are you really here, Isabella?" The question, so direct and loaded with meaning, almost made Isabella crumble. For a moment, she considered telling him everything about Marcus, about the guilt, about how her initial desire for redemption had turned into something much deeper and more frightening. "I'm here because I believe in your potential for recovery," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "Because despite all your initial defenses, You've proven yourself to be someone who deserves a second chance at life." "A second chance," he repeated thoughtfully. "Sometimes I wonder if you're not more broken than I am. You just hide it better." The remark hit Isabella with painful precision. Tears threatened to form in her eyes, but she held them back. "We're all broken in some way, Samuel. The difference lies in how we choose to deal with our fractures." That evening, driving home in the persistent Portland rain, Isabella made a decision. She stopped in front of the Oregon State Penitentiary where her brother was serving time. Even though it was late, she needed to see him. "Bella." Marcus seemed surprised to see her outside of normal visiting hours. "What happened?" "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm falling in love with him, Marcus, and every day that passes without telling him the truth is destroying me inside." Her brother watched her through the glass that separated them, his face marked by the weight of guilt and regret. "You've always been the strong one in the family, Bella, always taking on other people's problems, but this time you need to think of yourself." How can I think of myself when this could destroy everything he's achieved so far?" "Maybe," Marcus said softly. "The truth is exactly what you both need to really move on." Isabella left the prison with more questions than answers. In her apartment, she found a message from Samuel. "I've decided not to go to Seattle. Some things are more important than medical protocols. We need to talk." Essa. Sitting on her bed, Isabella looked at the photo of her brother and then at Samuel's message. The moment of truth was approaching, and she knew there was no avoiding it. The only question was, would she be strong enough to face the consequences? The brown envelope on Isabella's desk seemed to weigh a ton. Inside was the police report of the accident that had changed so many lives that rainy night. Her mother had sent it after her visit to Marcus, along with a note, "Maybe this will help you make the right decision." Her fingers trembled as she opened the envelope, even though she already knew its contents. The photographs of Samuel's wrecked Mercedes, the witness statements, Marcus's alcohol test. Everything was there documenting the exact moment when their fates intertwined in the most tragic way possible. Miss Reynolds. Elizabeth Winters. A voice through the phone snapped her out of her dark thoughts. "Samuel is having a difficult day. He tried to transfer himself to bed last night and fell. His pride is more wounded than his body, but I'll be there in 20 minutes, Isabella replied, already grabbing her keys. When she arrived at the Winters mansion, she found Samuel in the rehabilitation gym, completely ignoring the rest. Protocol he was supposed to be following after the fall. "You should be resting," she said, crossing her arms in the doorway. "And you should stop treating me like a child," he replied, dryly continuing his arm exercises. Isabella approached, noticing the bruise on his elbow. "What were you trying to prove last night?" Samuel stopped, finally meeting her gaze. "That I don't need anyone, that I can do things on my own." "And how did that work out for you?" A moment of silence followed, broken only by the soft sound of rain against the gymnasium windows. Samuel let out a frustrated sigh. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Why do you keep coming back even when I'm impossible to deal with?" Isabella's heart raced. It was the perfect moment to tell him the truth, to reveal everything. But the words got stuck in her throat. "Because I see beyond your anger," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "I see someone struggling to find their place in a world that has completely changed." "How do you always know the right thing to say?" Samuel asked, a small smile appearing on his lips. "Maybe because I'm trying to find my place too," she admitted, moving closer to adjust her positioning on the exercise machine. The touch of her hands on his shoulders sent an electric current through them both. For a moment, they stood there, too close to maintain the pretense of professionalism they were trying so hard to maintain. "Isabella," Samuel began, his voice hoarse, "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, Elizabeth entered the gym, followed by a man Isabella recognized instantly, Detective Michael Cooper, the officer who had investigated the accident. Her blood ran cold. The detective recognized her immediately, his eyes widening in surprise. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice laden with confusion, "I didn't expect to find you here. You know each other, Samuel asked, his gaze alternating between the two of them. "We met during the investigation into your accident," the detective replied before Isabella could intervene. "She's the sister of—" "Detective Cooper," Isabella interrupted him abruptly. "What a surprise! Can we talk in private?" Samuel watched the scene with growing suspicion. "What's going on here?" "Nothing," Isabella answered too quickly. "It's just some old business I need to sort out. Please continue your exercises. I'll be back." In a moment. In the corridor, Isabella practically dragged the detective away from the gym door. "Please don't say anything," she begged in an urgent whisper. "They don't know," Cooper asked, incredulity in his voice. "You're working with the victim of the accident your brother caused, and they don't know." "It's complicated," she replied, running her hands over her face in frustration. "No, Miss Reynolds, it's unethical," the detective replied, "and potentially illegal depending on how you got this position." "I'm qualified for this job," she defended herself. "My presence here has nothing to do with the fact that your brother destroyed this man's life," Cooper added. "I need to report this." "Please," Isabella begged, tears forming in her eyes. "I'll tell the truth. I just need to find the right moment." The detective studied her for a long moment. "You have 48 hours. After that, I'll be obliged to inform the Winters family." Isabella returned to the gym feeling dizzy. Samuel watched her with an intensity that suggested he had realized something was wrong. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," she lied, forcing a smile. "Shall we continue with the exercises?" But as she guided Samuel through his physiotherapy routine, Isabella knew she was running out of time. The universe was conspiring to bring the truth to light, and she needed to decide, would she be the one to reveal it, or would she let others do it? The rain continued to fall outside, constantly reminding her of that fateful night. In 48 hours, everything would change. The question was, what would be left after the storm passed? The tension in the corridors of the Winters mansion was palpable in the hours following Detective Cooper's visit. Isabella spent the night tossing and turning in her bed while the policeman's words echoed in her mind, 48 hours. Time slipped like sand between her fingers, and every second brought her closer to the moment she dreaded so much. The next morning, when she arrived for another session, she found Samuel more introspective than usual. He was in his office, surrounded by old papers and newspaper clippings. "What's all this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been researching the accident," he replied without raising his eyes. "It's strange how selective our memory can be. There are so many details that I've blocked out." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. "Why now?" "Detective Cooper's visit made me think there's something about that night that doesn't fit." He finally faced her. "And I have the feeling that you know more than you're telling me." Isabella felt her hands begin to shake. She busied herself organizing the physiotherapy equipment she had brought, trying to buy time to reorganize her thoughts. "Samuel, maybe we should focus on your recovery today. We have new exercises for—" "Don't change the subject," he interrupted her, his voice firm but not hostile. "Since yesterday you've been different. What did Cooper say to you in the hall?" "Nothing important," she lied, hating herself for every false word that came out of her mouth. "Just questions related to an old case." Samuel maneuvered his chair until he was directly in front of her. "Do you know what else I found out by researching the name of the driver who caused the accident? Marcus Reynolds." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Isabella felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been punched in the stomach. Samuel's eyes studied her intensely, looking for any reaction that would confirm his suspicions. "Reynolds," he repeated. "Like you." "Samuel," she began, but her voice faltered. "Please tell me it's just a coincidence," he begged, his voice betraying a vulnerability she rarely saw. "Tell me I haven't spent the last few months opening my heart to someone who—" "I was going to—" she interrupted, tears escaping her eyes. "Every day I tried to find the courage." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel pushed back his chair as if the physical proximity to her now hurt him. "So it's true," he said, his voice a pain-filled whisper. "You're his sister." "Yes," Isabella replied, knowing there was no turning back. "Marcus is my older brother." "And why did you come to work here?" "Guilt, curiosity." "What was your plan?" "At first it was about redemption," she admitted, the words pouring out like a dammed river finally finding its outlet. Marcus is destroyed by what he did. Our whole family is, I thought. I thought I could help in some way. By using me as a charity project. The bitterness in his voice was cutting. No, Samuel, none of it was false. My dedication to your treatment, the progress we've made together. The feelings that began to emerge, he added, his intense gaze piercing her. Isabella felt more tears streaming down her face. Especially those. I never planned. I never imagined that I would fall in love with you. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy as lead. Samuel closed his eyes as if trying to process everything he was hearing. "Get out," he finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "Samuel, please." "Get out!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the office. "I don't want to see you ever again." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, alarmed by the shout. "What's going on here?" "Ask her," Samuel replied bitterly. "Ask her about her brother Marcus." Recognition flashed across Elizabeth's face like a shadow. "Oh my God," she muttered, bringing her hand to her mouth. Isabella reached for her handbag, her hands shaking so much that she could barely hold on to her belongings. Before leaving, she turned around one last time. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking, "for everything, but especially for not being honest from the start. You deserve to know the truth." She left the mansion under a fine drizzle typical of Portland. The security guard watched her curiously as she practically ran to her car, tears now streaming freely down her face. Inside the vehicle, Isabella allowed herself to fall completely apart. Her phone rang. It was Detective Cooper. "They already know," she said as soon as she picked up. "It's over." "I'm sorry," he replied, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Sometimes the truth hurts, but it's always the best way." Isabella drove aimlessly through the wet city streets, her mind going over every moment of the last few months. Every smile, every touch, every advance they had made together, all now tainted by the shadow of a lie. Eventually, she found herself parked in front of the penitentiary. Marcus greeted her with a worried look, immediately realizing that something was wrong. "He found out," she said simply. "How?" "It doesn't matter how. It's over, Marcus. I've lost him. I've lost everything." Her brother watched her through the glass that separated them, helpless in the face of the pain he saw in her eyes. "Perhaps," he said softly, "some things need to be broken completely before they can be truly rebuilt." Isabella let those words sink into her mind as she drove home. The rain had picked up, turning Portland into a blur of fuzzy lights through her windshield. Somehow it seemed fitting his own world had also become an undefined blur of pain and regret. A week had passed since the revelation at the Winters mansion. Portland seemed grayer than ever, although Isabella suspected that this perception had more to do with her state of mind than with the climate characteristic of the Pacific Northwest. Elizabeth had hired a new physical therapist for Samuel, Dr. Richard Bennett, a renowned professional from Oregon Health and Science University. Isabella found out about this from Rachel, one of the mansion's nurses, with whom she had developed a friendship during her time there. "He refuses to do the exercises," Rachel confided during a chance meeting at St. John's Coffee Roasters. "He spends hours staring out the office window, just like he did before you arrived." The words hit Isabella like arrows. The thought of Samuel going backwards in his progress was unbearable. He had worked so hard, overcome so many obstacles. "Miss Reynolds!" A familiar voice interrupted her as she organized her belongings in her new workplace, a rehab clinic in Southeast Portland. It was Elizabeth Winters. Isabella felt her heart stop for a moment. "Mrs. Winters, please, can we talk in private?" They found a small cafe nearby. Elizabeth seemed to have aged years. In just a week, the worry lines on her face more pronounced than ever. "Samuel is self-destructing," Elizabeth began bluntly. "He refuses to continue rehab, has dismissed 3 different therapists, and is drinking more than he should." "I'm sorry," Isabella replied, her voice trembling. "I never meant to cause that damage." "I didn't come here to accuse you," Elizabeth surprised her. "I came because I need to understand. Why did you really come to work with us?" Isabella took a deep breath, gathering the courage to finally share the whole truth. "Marcus, my brother has been in prison for 6 months. Every night he has nightmares about the accident. Our mother cries alone in the kitchen, thinking no one notices. I thought I could do something to ease so much suffering. By manipulating my son. No, Isabella protested, tears threatening to fall. At first perhaps I came, with this mistaken intention of family redemption, but everything has changed. Every step Samuel took, every smile, every moment of shared vulnerability, it all became too real. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment. Do you love him? The question caught Isabella off guard. Yes, she admitted in a whisper, and that's why the lie has become unbearable. You know he's in love with you too, don't you? Elizabeth revealed, causing Isabella's chest to tighten. That's why the betrayal hurt so much. He had finally let down his defenses, allowed himself to trust and feel again. I never meant to hurt him, Isabella said, her voice breaking. Intentions rarely matter when it comes to broken hearts, Elizabeth replied, standing up. But perhaps you should know that he keeps all the progress reports you've written. I reread them even though I know I shouldn't. That evening, Isabella drove to the Portland Japanese garden, a place where she used to take Samuel for some outdoor therapy sessions. The garden was practically empty due to the persistent rain. Her phone vibrated. It was Marcus again. He had called every day since the revelation, worried about his sister. How are you, Bella? Surviving, she replied, watching the raindrops create ripples in the garden pond. I had a visitor today, Marcus said after a pause. Samuel Winters came to see me in prison. Isabella almost dropped the phone. What, when? This afternoon. He wanted to hear my side of the story. He wanted to understand why you did what you did. And what did you tell him? The truth. That you're the most selfless person I know. That your only flaw is that you carry other people's burdens as if they were your own. Isabella closed her eyes, letting the tears finally fall. That doesn't justify the lie, Marcus. No, it doesn't. But maybe it helps explain it. He seemed different when he left, less angry, more thoughtful. That information lit a small flame of hope in her chest, although she immediately tried to stifle it. She had no right to expect forgiveness or understanding. Back at her apartment, Isabella found an envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Samuel's familiar handwriting. The truth is too complex to be summed up in good or bad, right or wrong. I spent the week trying to hate you, but I realized that it was only destroying me even more. I don't know what to do with all these contradictory feelings, but I know I need to understand. You taught me not to give up. Maybe it's time I practiced what I've learned. Isabella held the paper against her chest, allowing herself for the first time in days to really breathe. The road ahead was still uncertain and possibly painful, but there was a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, a chance that maybe, just maybe, the truth could build something stronger than the lie had destroyed. Isabella parked her car in front of Portland General Hospital, where an unexpected meeting awaited her. Dr. Morrison had requested her presence to discuss Samuel's case, a call that surprised her considering recent events. The numbers don't lie, Ms. Reynolds, the neurologist said, spreading out graphs on his desk. Mr. Winter's progress during his sessions has been extraordinary. Since you left, he has not only stopped evolving, but is showing signs of regression. Isabella studied the data in silence, her heart squeezing as she saw the downward line on the mobility graphs. Why are you showing me this, doctor? Because I believe you're the only person capable of getting him back into treatment, Morrison replied, removing his glasses. Regardless of the personal circumstances involved, your method has worked where others have failed. He hates me now, Isabella said softly, and he has every right to. Hate is a powerful emotion, the doctor agreed, but not as powerful as love, and we all saw how you two looked at each other during the sessions. The sincerity in the doctor's voice caught Isabella off guard. Had she been that obvious? How many people had realized her feelings before she had even admitted them to herself? Leaving the hospital, Isabella received a message from Rachel. He's in the Japanese garden again, 3rd day in a row, same bench, same time. The garden had become a special place during rehabilitation. It was there that Samuel had taken his first steps with his walker, a moment of triumph that had culminated in a spontaneous hug between them. The memory still made his heart race. After an hour of internal debate, Isabella decided to go there. She found Samuel exactly where Rachel had said his wheelchair positioned, next to the carp pond. "You're still bending your knees the wrong way," she said softly, standing a few steps away. Samuel showed no surprise at her presence. "Old habits are hard to break." "How did you know I was coming?" "Because you've never given up on a patient," he replied, finally turning to face her. "Even when I should have." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of running water and the wind in the trees. Isabella fought the urge to move closer and adjust her posture, a professional reflex that now seemed painfully inadequate. "Why did you visit Marcus?" she finally asked. "Because I needed to understand," Samuel replied, his gaze lost in the water. "I needed to see the man who destroyed my life. I needed to hear from him why my physiotherapist, the woman I was falling in love with, was his sister." "And did you get the answers you were looking for?" "Some. Others only you can give me." He finally faced her directly. "Why did you keep going, Isabella, after we started to get closer, after it became more than just work? Why didn't you tell the truth then?" Isabella felt tears forming in her eyes. "Because every day that passed made the truth more impossible to tell. Because I was afraid of losing not only my patient, but the man who made me believe in second chances. The man who, even when broken, showed me more strength and determination than anyone I've ever met." Samuel closed his eyes, as if the words physically hurt him. "Do you know what's most ironic? I really believed that I had found someone who saw me beyond the wheelchair, beyond the accident. But all this time you've only seen me through the lens of your family's guilt." "No," Isabella protested, stepping forward. "Yes, at first it was about redemption, but every moment we spent together was real. Every breakthrough, every laugh, every lie," he added bitterly. "The only lie was omitting who I was," she replied, her voice trembling. "Everything else, my dedication to your treatment, my admiration for your strength, my feelings for you, all of it was true." "How can I believe you now?" "Maybe." "I can't," she admitted. "But your muscles don't lie, Samuel. Your body is responding to the treatment in a way that no one thought possible. Don't throw it away because of my mistake." Samuel watched a golden carp glide beneath the surface of the lake. "Do you know what Marcus told me? That you spend more time worrying about other people's pain than your own. Maybe that's why you're so good at what you do." "Marcus has always been very generous in his judgments," Isabella replied softly. "Or maybe he just sees the truth that you try to hide." Samuel adjusted his position in the chair, a grimace of pain crossing his face, a clear sign that he wasn't following the exercise program correctly. "Let me help you." Isabella took another step towards him. "I can't," he replied, although his tone no longer carried the previous bitterness. "Not yet." Isabella nodded, understanding. Some wounds needed time to heal, some bridges needed to be rebuilt brick by brick. "Dr. Morrison has a new treatment program," she said, preparing to leave. "Please don't give up on your recovery because of me." "Isabella," Samuel called out when she was already walking away. "That day in the gym when I could move my knee for the first time, was your hug real?" She turned, allowing him to see the tears on her face. "As real as my regret now." Elizabeth Winter's invitation arrived on a Wednesday morning, brought by a messenger in an elegant envelope. Isabella stared at it for long minutes before she found the courage to open it. Inside was a simple card with a handwritten message. "Winter's Pharmaceuticals Annual Benefit Dinner, Portland Art Museum, Saturday 8 p.m. Your presence is important for the future of the rehabilitation program." Isabella knew that this was no simple social invitation. Elizabeth was creating an opportunity, a neutral ground, where collapsed worlds could perhaps begin to reconnect. "You should go," Rachel said as they ate lunch together in the clinic. "Samuel has agreed to attend. It's the first time he's accepted a public event since, well, you know." Isabella played with her salad, her appetite suddenly gone. "I don't know if I have the right Rachel, showing up there in front of everyone. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are exactly those that make us most vulnerable." The Portland Art Museum looked stunning that Saturday evening. Isabella adjusted her navy blue dress, simple but elegant, as she climbed the marble stairs. Each step seemed to weigh a ton. The main hall was filled with Portland's elite pharmaceutical executives and renowned doctors. Dr. Morrison spotted her first, waving discreetly from his seat near the stage. Elizabeth Winters was talking to a group of investors, but her eyes met Isabella's immediately, and then she saw him. Samuel was next to the modern art exhibition, his wheelchair positioned so that he could observe both the works and the guests. He was dressed in an impeccable dark blue suit, his hair carefully groomed, a sight that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. "So you've come," Elizabeth's voice surprised her. The Winters matriarch had quietly approached. "I wasn't sure I should," Isabella admitted. "Sometimes the most difficult decisions are the most necessary." Elizabeth gestured towards the stage. "Samuel is going to announce a new company program, experimental treatments for spinal cord injuries, in partnership with the Seattle Rehabilitation Center." Did he decide to go to Seattle after all? No. Elizabeth smiled softly. He decided to bring Seattle to Portland. Winters Pharmaceuticals is funding a new research center here. Samuel's announcement was enthusiastically received by the audience. His voice was strong, confident, reminding Isabella of the CEO he was before the accident. But there was something different now, a new dimension of humanity in his words, when he talked about hope and second chances. During the reception that followed, Isabella kept her distance, watching from afar, as Samuel navigated his way through the guests with his usual ease. Occasionally their gazes crossed the hall, each encounter laden with unspoken words. "He asked for you," Dr. Morrison commented, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. "Every day during his appointments, he tries to disguise it, but he always ends up asking how you are." Isabella accepted the glass, but didn't drink. "How is he really, Doctor?" "Physically holding steady, but without the progress we saw before." "Emotionally?" The doctor paused significantly. "I think you already know the answer." Soft orchestral music filled the room, and a few couples began to dance. Isabella watched Elizabeth approach Samuel's chair, probably to remind him of his social obligations as host. "Miss Reynolds?" A familiar voice made her turn around. It was Detective Cooper. "May I have a moment?" They found a quieter corner near a modern sculpture. "I came to apologize," the detective said, surprising her. "My approach that day, well, not everything is as black and white as we usually think in the police." "You were doing your job," Isabella replied softly. "Maybe, but sometimes what's right by the law isn't necessarily right by the heart." He looked meaningfully in Samuel's direction. "He's been visiting your brother regularly, you know." Isabella felt her hands tremble. "Marcus didn't tell me." "Some bridges need to be rebuilt in private first," Cooper commented before saying goodbye with a gentle nod. The event was beginning to wind down when Isabella finally gathered the courage to approach Samuel. He was alone now, gazing at an abstract painting that dominated one of the walls. "It's about reconstruction," she said softly, stopping beside his chair. "The artist lost everything in a fire and painted this while rebuilding his life." "How do you know?" Samuel asked without taking his eyes off the canvas. "I read about him in college. He said that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what really matters. And what really matters, Isabella." The question hung between them, loaded with multiple meanings. Isabella felt her heart racing, aware that her answer could change everything for better or worse. "The truth," she finally answered, "even when it hurts, even when it threatens to destroy everything we've built. Because without it, nothing we've built is real." Samuel finally turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the world around him disappear. "What if the truth is that despite everything, I still can't stop thinking about you?" Samuel's confession in the museum changed everything. In the days that followed, Isabella was plunged into a maelstrom of contradictory emotions, torn between the hope his words had ignited and the weight of the guilt she still carried. The new Winters Pharmaceuticals Rehabilitation Center was beginning to take shape. From the window of her clinic in southeast Portland, Isabella could see the cranes erecting the structures of what would be one of the most advanced research centers in the country. The irony didn't escape her. The place that would represent hope for so many had been born out of a web of lies and redemption. He wants you on the team, Dr. Morrison revealed during a follow-up appointment. Samuel insists that your method of treatment be a fundamental part of the new center's protocol. That's complicated, Isabella replied, her heart racing at the news. Life usually is, the doctor replied with an understanding smile, but we rarely get the chance to turn our biggest failings into something meaningful. That afternoon, Isabella received an unexpected message from Elizabeth. Mansion Garden, 7 p.m. Samuel wants to show you something. The sun was beginning to set when Isabella arrived at the Winters estate. The garden, once a symbol of all that Samuel had lost, now showed subtle changes, new adapted paths, ramps discreetly integrated into the landscape. Samuel was waiting for her near the central fountain, a determined expression on his face. "Watch," he said simply. With a calculated movement, he locked his chair and, leaning on his arms, began to rise. Isabella held her breath, her professional instincts fighting the urge to run to help him. Slowly, using a specially designed walker, Samuel took 3 hesitant steps. You made it," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Thanks." "To you," he replied carefully, returning to his chair. "Even after you left, I continued practicing the exercises you taught me. Your voice, your instructions were still in my head." Isabella moved closer, her professional eyes automatically assessing his posture, the tension in his muscles, the signs of progress that only someone with his training could notice. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because I needed you, to see that you didn't destroy everything," Samuel replied, his intense gaze meeting hers. "What you did, the lie about your identity, hurt me deeply, but what you taught me about strength, perseverance, that was real." "Samuel, I'm not finished," he interrupted her gently. "I've been talking to Marcus a lot, about that night, about guilt, about forgiveness, about how a single decision can change so many lives." Isabella felt her legs tremble. "You never told me about these visits, because I needed to understand for myself first. Marcus is not a monster, Isabella. He's a man who made a terrible mistake and is paying for it. Just as you're not a manipulative villain, you're someone who tried to fix something broken in the only way you could think of." The evening breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, bringing the scent of flowers from the garden. Isabella realized. She was crying only when Samuel reached out gently, wiping a tear from her cheek. "The new center," he continued, "is not just about physical rehabilitation. It's about second chances, about rebuilding not just bodies, but lives, relationships, trust. Why are you telling me all this? Because I want you to be part of it, not just as a physiotherapist, but as a partner in the development of the program. Your experience, your dedication, your heart, that's what we need." Isabella took a step back, overwhelmed by the proposal. "People will talk. When they find out about Marcus, about me—" "Let them talk," Samuel replied firmly. "I've already wasted too much time worrying about what other people think. The accident taught me that life is too short to waste it on pride and prejudice." "What about us?" she asked softly, the question that had haunted her thoughts. For weeks, Samuel maneuvered his chair closer to her. "That depends on you. I can't promise it will be easy. There are still days when anger and hurt try to consume me, but I also can't deny what I feel for you, what I've always felt even when you tried to convince me otherwise." Dusk painted the Portland sky in shades of pink and gold, a spectacle that seemed to symbolize the end of an era of shadows and the possible beginning of something new. "I need to be completely honest with you," Isabella said, gathering her courage. "I still feel guilty. I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking about how I could have done things differently. And I still have days when the wheelchair feels like a prison, when the anger from the accident threatens to consume me," Samuel admitted. "But maybe we can learn to carry those weights together." The moment that followed was filled only with the soft sound of the water in the fountain and the wind in the trees. It was a silence full of possibilities, of fears and hopes intertwined. News of the partnership between Isabella and Winters Pharmaceuticals spread quickly through Portland's medical circles. Some questioned Samuel's ethics in hiring the sister of the man who had caused his accident, while others praised the initiative to turn a tragedy into something positive for the community. "You don't have to face this alone," Rachel said. watching Isabella organize her new room in the still under-construction rehabilitation center. Samuel knew there would be resistance when he made the proposal. Isabella adjusted a picture on the wall, a reproduction of the abstract painting they had contemplated together in the museum. "It's not the external resistance that worries me," she admitted. "It's this constant feeling that I'm getting something I don't deserve." The sound of artwork filled the room as the two walked down the center's main corridor. Through the large windows, they could see Mount Hood in the distance, its snowy silhouette contrasting with the Oregon autumn sky. "Dr. Reynolds? One of—" The builders called out to her, and Isabella still found the formal use of her surname strange, the same surname she had tried to hide for so long. "Mr. Winters asked me to inform you that the meeting with the investors has been brought forward to 2. The meeting in question would be crucial. Samuel planned to present the pioneering program they had developed together, an approach that combined traditional physical therapy with innovative techniques based on Isabella's experience with traumatic cases. "Nervous?" Samuel asked when she entered his office an hour before the presentation. He was practicing his morning exercises, showing a dedication that made her heart swell with pride. "Terrified," she admitted, instinctively adjusting his posture at the machine. "Half of those investors have probably Googled my last name. And they've discovered a dedicated professional with an impeccable track record at Oregon Health and Science University," he replied, capturing her hand before she pulled away. "The rest is our story to tell whenever and however we choose." His touch still sent shivers down her skin, an electricity that not all the conflicts and secrets revealed had managed to diminish. Over the last few weeks, they had established a new dynamic professional during the day, but with moments like this, charged with restrained intimacy and unspoken promises. The conference room was packed when they entered. Elizabeth took her usual place at the head of the table, her presence commanding immediate respect. Dr. Morrison smiled encouragingly from his corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel began, positioning his chair next to the projector, "what we will be presenting today is not just a rehabilitation program. It's a new approach to how we view trauma recovery and, most importantly, redemption." Isabella watched as he masterfully conducted the presentation, his strong, confident voice echoing through the room. When it was his turn to explain the methodology, he felt the weight of all the stares on him. "Trauma doesn't just affect the individual," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "It affects families, entire communities. Our approach recognizes this expanded dimension of suffering and works with it, not against it." The questions that followed were intense, some bordering on hostile. One of the older investors didn't hesitate to address the elephant in the room. "How can we trust the impartiality of this program," he questioned, "when its developer has such a complicated personal connection to the case?" The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella felt her heart racing, but before she could answer, Samuel intervened. "It's exactly that personal connection that makes our program unique," he declared. "Dr. Reynolds understands both the victim's side and that of the perpetrator's family. This dual perspective is invaluable in developing a truly holistic treatment." Elizabeth smiled discreetly, a glint of pride in her eyes as she watched her son defend not only the program, but also the woman next to him. After the meeting, Isabella met Samuel in the center's garden, where an outdoor rehabilitation area was beginning to take shape. "You didn't have to defend me like that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, gesturing for her to sit on the bench next to him. "Not just for you, but for us, for everything we stand for." "And what exactly do we stand for?" "Hope," Samuel replied simply. "Living proof that it's possible to overcome not only physical limitations, but also prejudices, sorrows, even our own mistakes." The sun was beginning to set, painting the Portland sky in shades of pink and gold, a sight that always reminded them of that night in the Winters' garden when they began their journey of rebuilding. Marcus's invitation arrived in a simple envelope, mailed from the state penitentiary. "My parole hearing is next week," the letter said. "I understand if you can't be there, but it would mean a lot to me." Isabella stared at the paper as she sat in her new room at the Winters Rehabilitation Center. Through the window she could see the Oregon mountains partially covered by low clouds, a sight that always brought her a strange sense of peace, even in the most turbulent times. "You should go," Samuel's voice surprised her. He was standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her with that intensity that always made her heart race. "Marcus deserves to have his sister by his side." "How did you?" "He told me about the hearing," Samuel replied, maneuvering his chair into the room. "In fact, he asked me to come too." The shock must have been visible on Isabella's face because Samuel continued, "Surprised I was too when he made the request. But after all our conversations over the last few months, it seems like the natural next step." Isabella stood up, walking over to the window. Her mind went back to that fateful night, to the phone call that changed everything, to the image of her brother in handcuffs. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, Samuel. Seeing you and Marcus in the same environment." "Life rarely waits until we're ready," he replied, stepping closer. "Sometimes we need to face our biggest scars to allow them to truly heal." The day of the hearing dawned cold and cloudy. Isabella met Samuel in the courthouse parking lot, his presence a silent anchor amidst the storm of emotions that threatened to consume her. Elizabeth surprised everyone by showing up moments before. The hearing began. "Winters always honors her commitments," she said simply, taking a seat next to her son. Marcus entered the room in handcuffs, but his eyes met Samuel's first. A moment of recognition passed between the two men, something deep and indescribable. That made Isabella hold her breath. The judge examined the documents meticulously. Marcus's exemplary behavior in prison, his studies in law through a prison education program, the letters of recommendation, including a surprising missive signed by Samuel Winters. "Your Excellency," Samuel asked for permission to speak, his firm voice echoing through the room. "I'd like to add something to the record." The silence that followed was palpable. Isabella felt her hand being gently held by Elizabeth as she watched the man she loved prepare to speak about the man who had changed her life so drastically. "Marcus Reynolds made a terrible mistake," Samuel began. "A mistake that cost us all a great deal. But over the last few months, through our conversations, I've learned that sometimes the greatest lessons in humanity come from the most unexpected places." He paused, adjusting his position in the chair. "The accident left me paralyzed, but it was my anger that truly imprisoned me. Marcus, through his genuine repentance and desire for redemption, helped me to see that there are different kinds of prison and different paths to freedom." Isabella couldn't hold back the tears as Samuel continued. "Today we are building a rehabilitation center that wouldn't exist without this tragedy. People will be helped, lives will be transformed, and part of that legacy ironically belongs to the man sitting there." The judge considered everything for long moments before announcing his decision. Marcus would receive probation with the condition that he work in the Winters Rehabilitation Center's community program. In the court corridor, after the hearing, Marcus approached Samuel. "I never imagined," he began, but Samuel interrupted him. "Neither did I," he said simply. "But maybe that's what true redemption means, doing something meaningful with the cards life has dealt us, even when they're the worst possible." Isabella watched the two men who defined her life, her brother and the man she loved, find an understanding that transcended any expectations she might have had. Elizabeth approached her, her presence always emanating that serene strength. "You know, dear, sometimes the universe has a peculiar sense of humor. Who knew that our family's greatest tragedy would become the bridge to our greatest blessing?" The sun finally broke through the clouds as they left the courthouse, its golden rays bathing Portland in a light that seemed to symbolize new beginnings. The new Winters Rehabilitation Center was finally ready for its official opening. Isabella watched the packed auditorium through a gap in the stage curtain, her heart beating fast at the sight of the unique mix of people gathered there: doctors, patients, family members, the press, and most significantly both the Winters family and her own relatives. "Nervous," Marcus's voice sounded behind her. His brother was adjusting the tie of the uniform he wore as coordinator of the center's community program, a position that, surprisingly, he held with natural aptitude. "Terrified," she admitted, turning to help him with his tie. "I never imagined we'd all be here like this." "Neither did I," he smiled softly, "especially not after that night." The implied mention of the accident still caused a tightness in Isabella's chest, but now it was different, like an old scar that, although still sensitive to the touch, no longer bled. Samuel crossed the corridor towards her, his motorized wheelchair moving silently over the new carpet. In recent months, his mobility had improved significantly, but he had chosen to keep the chair for long public occasions like this. "We need you both on stage in 5 minutes," he informed her, his eyes meeting Isabella's with that familiar intensity that still made her stomach turn. "The press are especially interested in the story behind the center." "Are you sure about that?" Isabella asked, her voice betraying her apprehension. "Telling our story publicly?" "That's exactly what needs to be done," Elizabeth interfered, joining them backstage. "Some stories need to be told not just for what they are, but for what they can inspire in others." The auditorium fell silent as Samuel took his place at the microphone. Under the stage lights, Isabella could see every detail of his face. The small frown lines around his eyes, the way his jaw tensed slightly when he was nervous, details he had learned to read and love over the months. "Welcome to the Winters Rehabilitation Center," he began, his voice strong and clear. "This place was born out of tragedy, but has grown into something far greater than any of us could have imagined." Isabella felt Marcus's hand squeeze. Hers as Samuel continued, 18 months ago an accident changed my life forever. I lost the use of my legs, and for a while I also lost my humanity. Anger and resentment consumed me." He paused, his eyes meeting those of Isabella in the audience. "Then I met an extraordinary physiotherapist who not only helped me regain movements that doctors thought impossible, but also taught me about forgiveness and starting over. What I didn't know was that she carried her own burden. She was the sister of the man responsible for my accident." A murmur went through the audience, but Samuel continued. "When I found out the truth, I thought everything was ruined. But sometimes it's precisely when we think we've lost everything that we find our greatest strength." Isabella took to the stage when called, her heart beating so hard she was sure the microphone would pick it up. Next to her, Marcus also stood up, his hands still shaking slightly. "This center isn't just about physical rehabilitation," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "It's about recognizing that trauma and healing are experiences that affect entire families, entire communities. It's about understanding that redemption is not a destination, but a journey." The presentation continued with details about the center's innovative programs, but the most impactful moment came when Samuel demonstrated his recent progress. Using a new type of device developed by the team, he was able to take several steps unassisted, drawing emotional applause from the audience. After the event, as guests circulated around the cocktail party in the center's garden, Isabella found a moment of quiet in the physiotherapy room, the space that had become her sanctuary in recent months. "So this is where you hide," Samuel said, entering the room. "Some things never change." "Some things change completely," she replied, turning to face him. "Are you really okay with all this, exposing our history like this?" Samuel maneuvered his chair closer, taking her hand. "You know what I've learned from all this, that sometimes the stories that are hardest to tell are exactly the ones that need to be heard the most. And ours. What story is that exactly?" "A story about how love can be born in the most unlikely places," he replied, gently pulling her closer. "About how the truth, no matter how painful, always opens the way to something deeper and more real." Through the window they could see Marcus chatting animatedly with a group of patients, his enthusiasm for the community program evident in every gesture. Elizabeth watched the scene from afar, a serene smile on her face. "I still can't believe we made it this far," Isabella murmured, resting her forehead against Samuel's. "I believe it," he replied softly. "I can believe it," he replied softly. "Because you taught me that the best new beginnings are the ones we build through our imperfections, not in spite of them." The opening of the Winters Rehabilitation Center had taken place 3 months ago, and autumn in Portland painted the city in golden and red hues. Isabella watched through the window of her living room as a new patient arrived in her wheelchair, a young dancer who had suffered an accident during a performance. "Claire Morrison, 23 years old," Samuel commented, entering the room with the chart. "Her case reminded me a bit of mine at first. The same anger, the same despair." Isabella smiled softly, recognizing the sparkle in his eyes. Samuel had developed a special talent for identifying patients who needed more than just physical rehabilitation. They needed to find a new purpose. You should talk to her, Isabella suggested, organizing her materials for the first session. Your story might help her see beyond the present moment. Our story, he corrected, moving his chair closer. That's what makes this place special, isn't it? Each story of overcoming feeding the next. The center had become more than just a medical institution. It was a place of transformation. Marcus coordinated support groups for relatives of accident victims, bringing his unique perspective as someone who had been on the other side of the equation. Isabella, Elizabeth's voice surprised her. The Winters matriarch rarely visited the center's clinical area. Can we talk in private? Elizabeth's office maintained the same sober elegance as the Winters mansion, but now displayed photos that told a different story, images of the center of patients celebrating small victories, and a particularly touching one of Samuel taking his first steps with the new device. Samuel told me about the request. Elizabeth began pouring tea into fine china cups, about wanting to make it official. You two. Isabella felt her heart race. The night before, during a private dinner in the center's garden, Samuel had proposed that they stop hiding their relationship. I don't want to pretend anymore that we're just work colleagues, he had said. I want to be able to love you openly, with all the complications that might bring. I know it may seem inappropriate, Isabella began, but Elizabeth interrupted her with a gentle gesture. Darling, I've spent months watching you two dance around your own feelings, trying to maintain a professional distance that clearly no longer exists. If there's anything inappropriate, it's continuing to deny what's obvious to everyone. The press will love it, Elizabeth smiled. The CEO and the physiotherapist, a story of redemption and love born out of tragedy. But that's not why I support you. I support you because for the first time since the accident, I see my son truly alive again. Tears formed in Isabella's eyes. I'm so afraid of hurting him again. Love always carries that risk, Elizabeth replied, reaching for Isabella's hand on the table. But you've already proved that you're stronger together than apart. That afternoon, during a session with Claire, Isabella noticed that the young dancer was watching her curiously. You're her, aren't you? Claire asked suddenly. The physiotherapist from the story. The sister of... Yes, Isabella replied. Simply, it's me. How do you do it? Claire continued, her eyes glistening with restrained tears. How do you get over something like this? One day at a time, Isabella replied gently, adjusting her patient's position. And learning that sometimes our greatest wounds can become our greatest strength. Through the window of the physiotherapy room, she could see Samuel conducting a meeting in the next room. Even after all these months, her heart still leapt at the sight of him, not just out of the love she felt, but out of admiration for the man he had become. Marcus showed up at the end of the day carrying a stack of forms. The new community programs are full, he announced proudly. People from all over the country want to take part. You've built something incredible here, Isabella smiled at her brother. We built it, he corrected. All of us from the wreckage of that night. The sun was beginning to set when Samuel found Isabella in the therapeutic garden, her favorite place at the center. The autumn leaves danced in the wind, creating a golden carpet under her feet. Elizabeth told me about your conversation, he said, taking her hand. Did you plan it? She asked, arching an eyebrow. Maybe, he smiled, but only because I know my mother well enough to know that her approval would mean a lot to you. Isabella knelt beside his chair, her eyes level with his. Are you sure about this, about us? I've never been so sure about anything in my life, he replied, touching her cheek gently. You taught me that sometimes the truest love is born in the most unlikely places. The October wind blew gently around them, carrying promises of change and renewal. Isabella knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time since that fateful night, she felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Snow was falling softly over Portland when Isabella parked her car at the Winters Rehabilitation Center that December morning. A year had passed since the opening, and the building, once so new and imposing, now emanated a cozy feeling of home. Claire Morrison, the former dancer, was giving a special performance in the auditorium, her first since the accident. Using a device similar to the one developed for Samuel, she had created a choreography that incorporated his wheelchair-turning limitations into art. She's amazing, Samuel commented, approaching Isabella as they watched the final rehearsals. "Remember when she came here swearing she'd never dance again?" Isabella smiled, remembering the first stormy sessions with Claire. "You did that." "Your story gave her hope." "Our story," he corrected discreetly, taking her hand. The engagement ring glowed softly under the auditorium lights, a surprise Samuel had planned during the center's last charity gala 3 months earlier. Marcus entered the auditorium carrying stacks of programs for that evening's presentation. His community program had expanded to 3 other states, and he would be traveling to Seattle next week to oversee the opening of a new facility. "The governor has confirmed his attendance," he announced, adjusting his tie, a nervous habit that had remained since his early days at the center. "And Reuters wants to do a special story on the reintegration program." Elizabeth joined them, her heels echoing on the wooden floor. "The tickets are sold out," she informed them with evident satisfaction, "and the new research pavilion is ready for inauguration next month." Isabella looked at the family that fate had given her in such an unlikely way. Elizabeth, who had turned from a potential adversary into a second mother. Marcus, who had found his purpose by helping other families deal with trauma and guilt. And Samuel, who had turned his greatest tragedy into a legacy of hope. "We need to talk," Samuel said softly, guiding his chair towards the winter garden, his private refuge since his first days in rehab. The garden was decorated for Christmas, small white lights intertwined in the plants, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The snow kept falling on the other side of the glass panels, isolating them in their own private world. "I've received the latest test results," he began, his voice calm, but charged with emotion. "Dr. Morrison thinks that, with the new experimental treatment, I can regain up to 70% of the mobility in my legs." Isabella felt her heart race. They had been working on this possibility for months, but hearing confirmation made it all the more real. "The treatment will be intensive," she replied, her professional side automatically assessing the implications. "We'll need to adapt the center's entire schedule." "Isabella," Samuel interrupted her gently, "I'm not talking to my physiotherapist right now. I'm talking to my fiancé." She knelt beside his chair as she had done so many times before. "Sorry, it's hard to separate sometimes." "I know," he smiled, touching her cheek. "It's one of the things I love about you, how deeply you care. About every aspect of what we do here." "Are you nervous?" she asked, studying his eyes. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not just about the treatment, but what if it works? What if it doesn't? How will it change who we become?" Isabella intertwined her fingers in his. "Nothing will change who we become. Our story isn't about your wheelchair or my surname. It's about how we chose to rebuild something beautiful from the wreckage." A soft violin sound reached them. Claire had started her dress rehearsal. The music flowed through the center, reminding them of how many lives had been touched by what they had built together. "You know what Claire said to me the other day?" Samuel commented, a smile appearing on his lips. "That we're proof that sometimes the universe breaks things so that we can rebuild them in a better way." Isabella felt tears forming in her eyes. "When did our patient become so wise?" "Probably when we stopped being just her therapists and became her family," he replied, pulling her closer. "As has happened with so many others here." The sound of footsteps made them look towards the garden entrance. Elizabeth and Marcus were there, identical smiles on their faces. "Claire's ready," Elizabeth announced, "and she insists that you two be in the front row." As they made their way to the auditorium, Isabella reflected on how fate had intertwined their lives in ways that neither of them could have foreseen. The pain that had brought them together had turned into purpose and purpose into love. "Ready?" she asked Samuel when they reached their seats. "With you by my side." He smiled that smile that still made her heart leap. "Always." The lights in the auditorium dimmed, and Claire began her dance, a story of loss, acceptance, and rebirth, told through movement. Isabella held Samuel's hand, feeling the warmth of his presence, the solidity of his love. The future ahead of them was uncertain, but now they knew they didn't have to have all the answers. They had learned that sometimes the most beautiful stories are those written between the lines of fate, in the small daily choices of love and forgiveness. And while the snow continued to fall outside inside the Winter's Rehabilitation Center, Another chapter of healing and hope was being written not just for Samuel and Isabella, but for everyone who found their way there seeking not just physical recovery, but the chance to rebuild their lives in ways they had never imagined possible.